Welcome back, everybody, to Neutrality Studies. I am joined today again by Dr. David Gibbs, a professor at the University of Arizona. David, welcome back.
Thank you for having me, Pascal.
Thank you for coming back online. And we want to talk about Iran, of course. And you are a historian. You've got very good and interesting perspectives on also the long-term development during the Cold War of the United States operations abroad. How do you see this latest Iran war tying in with the long-term policy of the United States?
Well, since I'm an American citizen, I'll give you essentially an American perspective on this war. And as I would see it, the United States has, with the end of the Cold War, been basically looking for new enemies. At the end of the Cold War, it's so remarkable that the United States had no enemies. I remember in 1990, Colin Powell, who was then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, gave an interview with Stars and Stripes, the official military newspaper. And I remember the quote exactly. He said, "Think hard about it. I'm running out of demons. I'm running out of villains," as if that's a bad thing. And obviously, if you're a military man, I guess that is a bad thing because you're trained, your whole career is based on the idea of enemies. And if you're running out of enemies, I guess that's viewed as a negative. Now, the normal person without self-interest might see that as a good thing, since after all, who would really want war? And the answer is their whole vested interests that wanted war, that thrived in war, and that profited from war. There was, of course, Eisenhower's military-industrial complex, but it's broader than that, including think tanks, elite academics, elite journalists. Academia had a, you might say, a gravy train based upon the Cold War, at least the American side did. There were lots of grants and scholarships and book contracts, secret work for the Central Intelligence Agency, often editing, paying you to write books and then editing them for you in secret, that kind of thing. Lots of academics did these things. And with the end of the Cold War, there was a lot of joking about it. There was a left-wing magazine that no longer exists called The Lies of Our Times that I think in the early 90s had a cartoon that had the headline of the future. And the headline read, "War to be declared tomorrow." And the subheadline read, "Enemy to be selected soon." With the implication, obviously, that, you need to have some kind of enemy, but we don't really know who that enemy is. And so they were looking for an enemy. And, Iran was one of multiple enemies. Russia, obviously, China's another enemy. Arab terrorism, defined very broadly as an enemy. And all of these, I think, don't come out of nowhere. I mean, obviously, there's a psychological need for a boogeyman, for a simple explanation for all our problems, I suppose that. But I don't like psychological explanations. I think there were material interests here. And the material interests were to find some justification for this enormous military the United States had, and it was only slightly downsized after the Cold War, to find a justification for hundreds of overseas bases, again, which had no function if the Soviet Union was gone, but it needed a function. They had to find a function. There were fleets around the world. There was the security apparatus, the CIA, and all the other agencies. And so I think looking for an enemy created a psychological construct, a concept, which was that if you look for an enemy, you'll find an enemy. And Iran clearly was an enemy. It was a convenience enemy because, after all, they seized the U.S. Embassy. We never, 1979, held the U.S. Embassy staff hostage. We never forgave them for that. So there's a bit of a personalization there. But I think the overall one was that they were one of multiple enemies. And it's very easy to blame this on Trump and say Trump is an oddball, he's a madman, whatever you want to say, which is to some degree true. I mean, look what he's doing in Iran. But this is a bipartisan project. And what Trump is doing in Iran is much more, I'd say, a broad continuity with the past than a deviation from it.
Yes, so you are putting this, of course, into the context of U.S. foreign policy of how the Cold War ended. But there's these two schools of thoughts. I would say when it comes to Iran, one is let's call them the Mearsheimer-rights, who basically try to explain it with the influence, try to explain the Iran war and the entire Middle East strategy of the United States with Zionism and the Zionist lobby. And the other ones, I would say, like commentators like Brian Berletic. I just read his latest post. He's saying, like, if you really believe that the United States that Israel runs the United States, you're either delusional or dishonest. His whole argument is that no, this is the United States running the show. It is Israel that is basically the proxy over there that is needed in order to realize that kind of policy, this kind of finding an enemy, right, by creating an enemy and creating something so alien to the region that it necessarily must blow up the entire region. Which of the two camps do you think has the is closest to the way that the historical development like lets us guess what it is?
I lean somewhat closer to Mearsheimer's interpretation. There's no denying the influence of the Israel lobby, which is enormous and extremely influential. I see it in my classroom. I told my class I'm not going to discuss the Iran war or anything having to do with Israel-Palestine because there are groups on campus, on every campus in America, or many of them certainly, that track professors in terms of what they say on Israel-Palestine, and you can get into a lot of trouble if you say the wrong thing. You'll have to justify yourself, you'll be demonized, and so on and so forth. There used to be a case where I could say anything I wanted in class, but those days are over. And a lot of that has to do with the Israel lobby. And so I don't think there's any point in trying to minimize the significance of it. I think that Mearsheimer's book, which he co-authored with Stephen Walt at Harvard, The Israel Lobby, about 20 years ago, there's no doubt they were right on that. I think it is deeper than what they said, however, and I think the way I would look at it is that Israel was seen as you had the growth of the neoconservative ideology. I've spoken about it on this show before, and as I see it, this was a outgrowth of America's failure after Vietnam in the late 1970s, and it was an effort to reinvigorate American militarism after its failures in Vietnam, and to try and push back against what they saw as devilish tendencies in the American political system. And the neoconservative ideology, both its Jewish and Gentile components, saw Israel as their model. And what they liked about Israel was that Israel used military force unapologetically. They used maximal military force offensively, not just defensively, but offensively. They attacked, they didn't just defend. And at least in the mythology, not so much in reality, but in the mythology, they always won. They always performed brilliantly. That didn't in practice happen in many cases, but that's how they saw it. And so you had basically a situation where they saw Israel as what America should be like. Oh, one more thing about the idea of Israel was to disparage negotiations, at least to downplay negotiations, use them as little as possible. Military force solves problems. Negotiating is for the weak, is for the weak. And so it seemed to the neoconservatives, to the neoconservative ideologues who grew up during this period, that Israel was pointing the way to what America should be like. And they were heavily funded by the military industrial complex, the neoconservatives. They had a series of lobby groups. And gradually, over time, they gained more and more influence in both parties. They started out actually in the Democratic Party, and then they moved to the Republican Party, and they moved back and forth. And they're very much present. Trump has expressed a lot of skepticism about neoconservatism, but now he clearly is following the neoconservative playbook, and that essentially is turning America into Israel. And many people have said that America needs to be more like Israel. We need kind of Israel-style security and with the disparaging of civil liberties and privacy. We need to dismiss negotiations. We need to aggressively attack not just people who threaten us or people like, but people might hypothetically threaten us. I think the use of hypothetical threats here to justify aggression was very much part of the Israeli playbook. Um, and so I think that you had sort of the merging of almost um, Israel and the United States into one. And that was the neoconservative idea, and that's the policy now. So as I would see it, it's more than the Israel lobby. It's much more as well that the Israeli idea is located in the U.S. government, and that the idea of what America should be like is based upon the Israeli experience, and that's playing out right now before our eyes in Iran, based on the idea that Iran might hypothetically someday be a threat.
Right.
The hypotheticals here is very interesting to me. The idea that if somebody might hypothetically threaten you, you should treat it as a certainty and attack them. Um, The opportunities are limitless. I mean, hypothetically, anything's possible. Hypothetically, aliens from outer space could attack us. The Loch Ness Monster could come out of Scotland and attack us. I don't know. I'm being a bit flippant here, but if you wanted to hypotheticals, why not go all the way, I suppose? Um, and so Iran hypothetically might do something, so it's legitimate to attack them. This, by the way, was formalized by Richard Cheney, a prominent neoconservative,
Yeah.
Vice President Richard Cheney. He called it the 1% doctrine. And he said that if a country presents even a 1% threat that they might go to war with us and present a security danger to us, we should treat it as a 100% threat with the idea that we should attack them. It's always safer to attack and to go to war than to seek peace, I guess is the idea here. And any threat of any minimal amount should be regarded as a near certainty, which makes no sense. Logically, it makes no sense, but that really is the neoconservative idea, the 1% doctrine.
Hey, very brief intermission because I was recently banned from YouTube, and although I'm back, this can happen anytime again. So please consider subscribing not only here, but to my mailing list on Substack. That's pascalotta.substack.com. The link's going to be in the description below, and now back to the video.
It's kind of offensive realism on steroids, right? Where you basically argue that no. I mean, the offensive is the important thing, and you need to make sure that any kind and type of threat is immediately removed. So there cannot be a balance, right? Because balance implies that you accept that the other one has a certain way. No, the neoconservative idea is complete, utter, total domination, and nothing less is acceptable. As a and it's treated as a security threat, not just as a problem, not just as something to be negotiated. No, it is a security threat that needs to be eliminated. So, like offensive realism on steroids. But the thing with Israel, though, you know what? At the moment, I'm thinking so much about is like how to understand this as a political project, and I'm at the point where I would argue that you cannot analyze the political process in the United States without the political process in Israel and vice versa. These two are, Mearsheimer would say, joined by the hip, but maybe even that they share the same bloodstream. They are Siamese twins. And and in a sense, what you just said, makes me think of Israel as the unshackled United States, a United States without the U.S. Constitution and without the same constraints, and hence a a model for the neocons. And they're trying to import that back in. And the Israelis, on their part, they import all the weapons, all of the productive capacity of the United States, and round it goes.
Something like that. I suppose the only thing I would slightly disagree with is, it is in a sense offensive realism on steroids, except that realists, a la Mearsheimer, would insist you have to be cautious. You have to weigh the possibility of risk, that you might fail, might be defeated. Whereas the neoconservatives tend to throw caution to the wind, and they insist that it's all a question of willpower, or at least they imply that. And the idea is that those who disagree with them are showing lack of spine, lack of moral certitude, or some character flaw, perhaps. And that if only America is only a superpower if it acts like a superpower, is what they would say. And acting like a superpower means constant shows of force. The bottom line is the system that we have set up here, that basically, when you create this enormous military, um, you have to use it periodically. You have to use it. There's no way you can justify the existence of this enormous outsized military, far larger than any in the world. Again, people talk about the threat from China. China has a GDP approximately the same size as the United States, larger by the PPP standard, but their military is much smaller. Their military spending, their level of spending as a percentage of GDP is much smaller. And so the United States basically has this world-class military, like such has never been seen before. And if you have that, you have to use it periodically. And so the ideology of neoconservatism fit in very nicely with that idea, with that institutional need to use the military. Um, again, we're seeing that now in Iran, that if you have this constant pressure to use the military to do something, and this ideology based upon hypothetical threats of something that might hypothetically go wrong and attack you, I guess that fits in and justifies what we're doing in Iran. I guess the only problem is we could very easily and very likely will lose this war, and what happens then is anybody's guess.
When I talked yesterday to Mohammad Marandi, I mean, he made it very clear that, the Iran is not waiting for the United States to offer peace. Iran already rejects any type of short-term ceasefire, and the war will end when Iran decides that it will end. So their strategy seems to be to absorb as much as they can, and to basically, in essence, they want to dispel. They want to chase the United States out of West Asia and demand not only a ceasefire on paper, but take away the material capability of the United States to wage again war within the next years. How likely do you find it that this is an achievable goal? Because after all, you're right. I mean, the United States has the most formidable military force on Earth, but even that is not infinite.
I was listening to Theodore Postel, the weapons specialist at MIT, who was extremely informative and very expert. And he basically said that missile defense systems basically don't work against ballistic missiles. I think they work against fighter planes, which are barely being used here, at least not at close range. And they work against drones, but ballistic missiles, they just don't work. And so the United States cannot, and Israel cannot really shoot down a lot of these missiles. And the missiles, the interceptors are extremely expensive and few in number, and being depleted very rapidly, whereas Iran seems to have a remarkable supply of missiles and drones. And if they run out of them and run out of the ability to manufacture, there's a likelihood, I would think, Russia and or China would help replenish them because they have a strong interest in doing so. And so there is a reasonable possibility Iran may just win this war, in the sense that all they have to do, as many have noted, is survive, to be standing at the end of the day. And also, they're engaging in, I think, what some have called vertical escalation. They're not just attacking Israel, they're attacking almost all of America's allies in the Middle East. They're attacking multiple Gulf states, and they're trying to demonstrate, and are demonstrating, that America not only cannot protect you, but America makes you more vulnerable to attack, that far from protecting you, the alliance with the United States weakens your security. And I think the Gulf states are figuring that out. And the Europeans, if they were smart, would figure that out too, that maybe NATO is not such a good thing. Maybe rejecting neutrality by Sweden and Finland is going to be a disaster because it makes you a target. It puts a target on your head, just as UAE just found that out, as Bahrain just found that out. And Iran is making this very clear, that that's what's going on here, is that America will not protect you. It makes you more insecure. And so I think what they really want to do as an end game is to force America to withdraw from the Middle East. Now, for America to do that would be almost announcing the end of the American empire. And
Right.
it would be end of the Trump presidency and end of the American empire. It's very hard for me to believe Trump would be willing to accept that. But what he will do if we simply start running out of missiles and start tiring. Oh, one more thing, of course, and vertical escalation is the closing of the Straits of Hormuz and the possibility of causing an economic downturn, maybe a very severe economic downturn, with devastating consequences. All of these things basically are playing to Iran's favor and will eventually run the risk of tiring the United States. But this could be a major turning point, and I wonder if Trump would want to be the president who presides over the defeat of the U.S. empire in the most humiliating way possible by a country we've always regarded as an inferior country, inferior at every level. We had no respect for the Iranians. And here they're going to defeat us. It would be a repeat under worse circumstances, that at worse timing, what the Vietnamese did to us in 1975.
Right, and in a much larger scale, in a sense, because it's not just a retreat from the country, it would be a complete retreat from the region. At least that's what the Iranians are apparently aiming for. And just to underpin what you just explained, they are also making the point in another way by exactly not attacking anyone who doesn't have U.S. military bases. Oman, not a single strike on Oman, not one, because no U.S. military bases, no installation. Oman is a friend of the United States, but not an ally. Oman is also a friend of Iran, and this is well understood. Marandi actually says, yes, I mean, if these Gulf states declared their permanent neutrality from now on and expelled the United States, or just at least said we're not going to renew any of these leases, then that would solve it, save the question of reparations. But the security structure is definitely that one that the Iranians are looking for. Now, for the United States, then I mean, one of the questions that's in the back of everybody's mind at the moment, also if I reading all the newsletters that I'm subscribed to, is like, is there a point where the US or Israel might just use their nuclear weapons in order to escalate to something that is so unthinkable that in the neocon mindset, oh, okay, this is the real power and this will end it once and for all.
That is the worry on my mind and on many people's minds, and with good reason, I think. And that if the United States were backed into a corner, and more significantly, if Israel were backed into a corner, Israel were facing defeat in this war, and Netanyahu personally were facing a defeat in this war, what would Israel do? Well, nuclear weapons is one possibility. It is one possibility. Israel has claimed, falsely by all indications, but his claim nevertheless is existential for them. And they've acted, at least superficially in public, as if it's existential. If that's the case, they can easily justify it to themselves and to each other, at least, as a cause for using nuclear weapons. Israel will be the first cause of concern. The United States also, under Trump, I would not think it impossible the United States would resort to nuclear weapons, because they would see that as a last resort. If we can't win with conventional weapons, then maybe we need to move to nuclear weapons, because again, acknowledging defeat in a war that may mean a permanent setback in a key region with global implications, that might be considered unthinkable and intolerable, not just for Trump, but for his advisors and some of the top military personnel. And so nuclear weapons would be considered an option under those circumstances. That is an enormous risk, enormous danger here, I think. And I don't know what to say about it, except that, we've been playing with this game with nuclear weapons, that we haven't used them since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Therefore, it's not really a serious problem. It's remarkable how the nuclear threat was treated as a constant worry when I was a child growing up during the Cold War. But after the Cold War ended, we pretended it stopped being an issue. There's almost no discussion of this. There's no anti-war movement. There's no anti-nuclear weapons movement in the West. There used to be an enormous one, but it's gone now. It's gone. And so people have forgotten about the risk here. And I think in that situation, the risk of using nuclear weapons is greatly increased.
Yeah, instead of denuclearizing, we denuclear feared. So
Exactly.
we still have the nukes, but we don't have the necessary fear anymore about them. So this is a most unfortunate development. But one of the things I was wondering, and I know you're probably not the person who has all of the information on that one. Probably we would need to talk to Ted Postel. The nuclear reactors that Israel has on its territory, aren't they the hugest liability? I mean, if Iran got struck by a nuclear weapon, wouldn't be the most natural thing to just shoot a couple of conventional missiles at these nuclear reactors and wreak havoc that way? Isn't that the kind of deterrent at the moment? But I haven't talked about this with anyone who actually knows how these things work. I just wonder if you have any thoughts on this.
Yeah, Israel's main nuclear production facility is at Dimona in the Negev Desert. It was built by France in cooperation with France in the 50s. And it, again, you'd have to talk to Ted Postel, being a technical specialist, something I'm not, but off the top of my head, I can't see any special reason why Iran couldn't use one of their more advanced missiles to target Dimona. They haven't done that yet, and I think for very good reasons they haven't done it. They have shown restraint, which I appreciate personally as a human being who values his life. But if they were struck with a nuclear weapon, of course, all bets are off. And striking at Dimona would, of course, be a realistic possibility. I'm assuming, and again, this is something you'd have to ask a specialist about, but I'm assuming there'd be considerable danger of spreading radioactivity over a large area
Yes.
in Israel and neighboring countries with very deadly effects.
Yes, and one thing is the Iranian leadership, and also according to Marandi, they usually don't really talk about Israel. They usually talk about Occupy Palestine. They are very much aware that the land that Israel sits upon is the land of the Palestinians, and they have no intention whatsoever to permanently radioactively poison the Palestine, right? So I mean these are part of these constraints that
Yeah.
they
That's true.
really operate within. Now, coming back to the United States, though, what do you think, or I did a couple of episodes about the evangelical component and this doomsday ideology of bringing about Armageddon, and how the U.S. president now has a faith office in the White House. And just last weekend they had this ceremony with him like at the desk, and his pastor praying to him and saying things like really dumb things, but I'm pretty sure Donald Trump loves to hear them. It's like saying no to Donald Trump is saying no to God, and stuff like that. And Pete Hegseth with his tattoos, and the Jerusalem cross and Deus Vult and so on, like the acknowledgement that there is a very, very strong component that wants this war, not in order to win and project power, but in order to bring about the end days and the second coming of the Christ. That's a completely different motivation for war from the neocons. Of course, it goes hand in glove with the neocons, but it's a different motivation. How important do you judge that stream of U.S. politics to be in this war?
It's very significant. I mean, just a little bit of the history is that evangelical Christianity, again, by evangelical, what we mean is a branch of mostly Protestantism that has a very literalist interpretation of the Old and especially the New Testament, and is sort of separate from the more mainstream Christian groups like the Presbyterians or the Methodists, and has a very emotional connection between individual Christians and Jesus Christ. The modern version, the U.S. is an exceptionally religious country. It stands out among all industrialized countries as exceptionally high level of religious identification. Um, and we've always had periodic upsurges of evangelical interest. One of them was in the 70s, and it emerged precisely at the moment of neoconservatism. And the distinctive thing about the 1970s version of evangelical Protestantism is that it established the idea of Christian Zionism. That was a whole new idea that I'm not aware there's any significant antecedents to it before the 70s.
For the
And
evangelicals, like, because Christian Zionism is very old when it comes to the UK, 250 years at least, but for the evangelical Americans, this was new.
well, or at least the mass, I mean, I'm sure there was always elements of it, but as a mass phenomenon that took hold of the whole evangelical movement and became a central feature of it, that was the 70s. That was very much the 70s. It's somewhat ironic because they did have a history also of anti-Semitism, um, but nevertheless, they put that aside, and for purely religious purposes, they became more intensely identified with the survival of the Jewish state, uh, even than many Jews. And the Israel lobby appreciated this, and I've been through the papers of one of the elements of the Israel lobby, the American Jewish Committee, from this period, and people are openly saying that this is a good thing because, after all, it increases our political punch. Jews at that time, in the 70s, were only about 3% of the US population. I think now they're 2%. They didn't really have that much electoral. They didn't have that many votes. Evangelical Christians, I think that was, if I'm not mistaken, I think about 35% of the US population by the mid-70s said they had been born again in Christ, the defining feature of being an evangelical. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of votes.
Right.
And so the Israel lobby put aside whatever reservations they had and ultimately cultivated and forged a relationship with these evangelicals because it increased their political power. Um, and mostly,
Which is just to interject, which is very interesting because the Christian evangelical, Christian Zionism, of course, views Jews as necessary implementation tools in order to get to Armageddon. But as soon as Armageddon comes, the Jews, of course, go to hell. But they're happy with that, right? That's just how it's supposed to be. That's the plan. Therefore, we are nice to the Jews now, and we help them with Israel and with the third temple. And then at the end, they're in hell, and we're in heaven. So that's how it's supposed to be, right? But they view them as that, which cannot be something that the Jewish Zionists are very happy about. But if you can use it, then why not? It's clearly not.
exactly. In other words, it was realpolitik. This is the way politics is done. It was an alliance.
Mm.
And it was an alliance of convenience, but it was an alliance all the same, and a very politically potent alliance. And so I think that's a key element of the Israel lobby, is the alliance with the evangelicals, many of whom were, it should be noted, working class, not just whites. There's also a heavy African-American element in the evangelical movement as well. Many more recent sort of Mexican-American immigrants are involved in it. So it's huge, and it's not just, it's multiracial. And it's working class to a significant degree. Many of these people are people who had long ago voted for the Democrats and enabled the Republicans to forge an electoral realignment based to some degree on religion. And again, Israel was a key component to all of this, and a key component that was very useful to the Israel lobby and to the Israeli government. And Trump, it's somewhat ironic. Now, Trump, of course, is blasphemous. He talks in a blasphemous way. His personal conduct is blasphemous. Um, his personal life is totally dissolute. But the evangelicals tend to overlook that, and that he's engaging in activity that they approve of, including obviously rock solid support for Israel. And so I think that basically this kind of intense pro-Christian attitude is another influence on Trump. It's an electoral influence. I find it very difficult to believe Trump has any real deep interest in Jesus Christ or the second coming or the end times or any of these things. But he likes power and he likes adulation, and he gets that from the evangelicals. And so I think this is another very significant influence on him.
He's also at an age where, becoming more faithful or adopting certain beliefs would very much make sense, in terms of personal psychology.
It's possible.
But I have no indication about that whatsoever. So let's rather discuss, like, where do you see this influencing the other huge war of the United States that's still going on, the proxy war against Ukraine? I mean, the last 2 weeks were quite interesting. I mean, Ukraine has been immediately crowded out from the media, completely gone from the headlines of the New York Times and so on. And in a sense, Iran is now doing to Ukraine what Ukraine did to Corona. It's just, it takes up the oxygen, the media oxygen. Do you think this will actually translate into developments on the ground, or what are your information on how Ukraine is going?
Well, I mean, others have noted this, and it's no doubt true. There's no way this can work out except for the benefit of Russia, in the sense that the United States just doesn't have a lot of weapons to give to Ukraine anymore. Whether Europe pays for them or not makes no difference. The U.S. just doesn't have an inventory of weapons to give to Ukraine if they're expending them all on the war in Iran, with Iran, and if they're giving them all to Israel, and which they're doing. And so there's that. There's lack of focus and attention on Ukraine, which I'm sure must be very personally galling to Zelensky. And finally, there's the issue that it's very beneficial to Russia in terms of raising the global price of oil. Obviously, very unbeneficial to oil importers like Europe, for example, which are going to suffer very heavily from this and accelerate their deindustrialization. I mean, the dilemma of Europe is very remarkable. On the one hand, they cut off the main supply of oil and gas, which was Russia, and thought that was very clever of them. And then they bought much more expensive U.S. fossil fuels and remained reliant, of course, on supplies from the Persian Gulf. Now the Persian Gulf has been cut off. And of course, we should not be surprised a bit if Donald Trump and his nationalism imposes export controls on U.S. oil and gas. So Europe will be left out to dry, so to speak, and the deindustrialization of countries like Germany will be rapidly accelerated. And probably this will be a turning point for Europe, including politically. We should have every reason to expect parties like the AfD in Germany, the Rassemblement National in France, and so on, to rise very rapidly in response to these conditions. And nevertheless, Russia will be the beneficiary in the sense that they will gain much more revenue on account of a raised global price for oil and gas. That I'm sure is already happening.
Yeah, the pickle that the Europeans managed to maneuver themselves into willingly, seeingly, knowingly is something to be studied by future historians for.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. It's incredibly strange.
Um, but on on the other hand, like when you look at the Caucasus and Central Asia, we are already seeing how this war is unfortunately also spreading into there. Do you have any thoughts about, the potential involvement of Azerbaijan, Aliyev, and the way that Central Asia might look at this? I mean, if Iran is a direct neighbor to Afghanistan, right? And Afghanistan was fighting a war with the United States for 20 years. And actually, the Iranians are saying, look, we've seen all of these US wars in our region. We've studied them. We know how the US operates. This is a direct. This is now we apply the knowledge that we've gained through that. But how do you think the rest of the region that had already suffered wars with the United States is going to develop or going to approach this?
I'll say this. I mean, I honestly, I don't have a good answer to that. What I would say is if they're smart, what they'll do is establish as close as possible, essentially a neutral position on America's wars, and possibly try and achieve some kind of at least proper modus vivendi with their nearest neighbor, which is Russia. Um, just because it's their nearest neighbor, and it's always wise to be on good terms with your nearest neighbor. Um, and I think that again, what is being demonstrated very clearly in the Middle East, everybody should have anticipated, was that American bases, alliance with the United States reduces your security.
Right.
By the way, one of the things I did want to comment on is I've been fascinated in a very and confused in some ways about Sweden and Finland.
Right.
Sweden and Finland had been neutral since '47. Sweden for centuries, literally, had been neutral, and they did quite well with neutrality. Their security was ensured. They didn't get drawn into conflicts, and now they're giving up their security for an America that is not only unreliable and views Europe with contempt, but is openly a threat to their security, as being demonstrated in the Gulf right now. And one wonders if somebody should perhaps have taken the Swedes and the Finns and shaken them a bit by the scruff of the neck and said, "What are you thinking, guys?" Um, because it doesn't seem to be what they're doing is rational. A lot of this is based upon hypotheticals. What if Russia does this? What if Russia does that? There was a book recently published by a German academic called If Russia Wins. It's a bestseller in Europe, I'm told. It's by this guy named Masala, who's a professor with very close ties to the Bundeswehr and with NATO. And it's literally fiction of, Russia goes and starts acting militarily aggressively, beginning with the Baltics. And it's fiction, and people are treating it and reviewing it as if it were real.
Yeah.
And that's happened before. In the 1980s, a British general did exactly the same thing. He wrote a book called The Third World War, which is a fictionalized account of Russia attacking Western Europe, and people treated it as if it were a documentary. And I think what we have here is an extreme a case of the neoconservative logic now being applied to Europe, which is treating hypothetical threats as actual threats and remote threats as certainties, and then planning accordingly. And always, it's safer to militarize than to demilitarize. All right. And none of that makes any sense when you think about it, but that's the logic here being applied in Europe as well as in the United States and Israel, of course.
I have two pieces that to explain this. One is, of course, that yes, the Europeans, the Swedes and the Finns included, swallowed the pill, the neoconservative pill
Yep.
that you just described, and that they work in these hypotheticals, and they've worked themselves into a point where the hypotheticals are believed as dogma. It's basically, if Russia wins, then naturally the next step will be the Baltics. It's absolutely clear, it's like the domino theory. It's taken for certainty that this is what's going to happen, right? And if you question that, then you're the delusional one. So that's the
The
first.
fact that there's no evidence to support that is of no importance to them.
It doesn't matter. Dogma doesn't
Yeah.
depend on evidence. Dogma depends on belief.
Can I just add to that? I mean, like coming at it from the United States, again, with a long memory, because I've been around for a while. During the Cold War, there was some tendency of Americans to look at the Europeans as the smart ones. They were the ones who showed nuance. They were the ones who didn't get carried away with boogeymen and rhetoric and so on. And the European press was much better than the American press. I remember reading Le Monde, and it was much better than the New York Times. Even the British press, the BBC, was better than their American counterparts. Now they're everything in Europe. I said I don't read German, but I read French. It's the New York Times.
I know, but it makes sense, doesn't it? After 30 years, 35 years of having won the Cold War and having to admit that the United States approach was actually correct in winning the war, right? That everybody in Europe started integrating, right? Including the newspapers. So all of the big European newspapers are downstream New York Times these days. They'll open the New York Times in order to understand how the world needs to be framed, and then they go along with that because that is objective truth to them. And so the other element, by the way, on Finland and Sweden is that the Europeans have lost the capacity to think outside the realm of deterrence. deterrence is all they can think about, and within the framework of deterrence, you just have no space. Your frame excludes the option of having like neutrality as a security strategy, because it's not deterrence. Because you need to scare the other one into not attacking you. That's it. And under
The
that frame,
possibility that you could scare them into actually attacking you seems to not have crossed their minds.
no, it does. But it's the reason why they argue we need to militarize, because we are too weak, so we will invite attack. Therefore, we need to militarize. So the whole idea of no, if we are no threat to anyone, if we only have friends on all sides, then we're perfectly fine. That is just outside of the way that they can think about military strategy. And a large part, not all, but a large part, especially in the establishment, have lost the ability to think in those non-deterrence terms. So what we need to study is actually to understand how they managed to install that. How 35 years of that,
Yeah.
how did 35 years manage to again crowd out the other security paradigm?
It is interesting. I mean, basically, that you've had almost, it's not just a political, but almost an intellectual conversion of the
Yeah.
European elite and the
Yeah.
European thinking class, shall we say, to be carbon copies of the United States. Another thing, I guess, it's rather interesting is that, it's not as if the American alliance has worked out that well. Again, we're seeing the effects of the American alliance in the Gulf. I'm just wondering if people in Sweden and Finland would say, "Gee, I wonder if that's a look." Well, UAE and Qatar allied with the United States, and now they're getting attacked. They wouldn't have been attacked if they hadn't done that. Um, we'll see. I mean, if this has any effect on causing them to rethink their strategy. Another one, of course, is the issue of guns versus butter. I mean, Europe is deindustrializing. They are making themselves actively poorer. They've been doing that all, and this is going to make it even worse. And they've done it to themselves. This is to policies that they themselves have followed. They didn't have to follow. And now they're going to raise the military budget, talking about 5% military budget from maybe 1%. This is going to come out of their living standards. And they're openly saying we should happily do that. They might look at the United States. The United States basically is a country with enormous social problems. It's basically all the infrastructure is broken down, appropriate to a much poorer country. You go to Europe and it's much nicer there. The Europeans want to give all that up so they can look like the United States. It just seems like a very strange idea.
It is, but in their mental framework, it's not the Americans that do that to them. It's not themselves that is doing it to them. It is the Russians. It's the Russians create that threat, and because of that, we are suffering, right? And
That's the
if they
rationalization.
stop threatening us, if they were civilized people, we wouldn't have to do this. I mean, it's perfectly rational within their framework. So it's very unfortunate, but it will continue for rather a long time, I think, until I see this at least 20 more years until a next generation comes along that will have to restudy what actually happened and reassess. But the people who are within the current assessment, they will maintain it until the end of
I'm
the
wondering
very much.
if you might get a social rupture in Europe. And well, I mean, we could in the medium term, very easily, it's very easy to imagine an AfD government in Germany, for example. Um,
It is.
the right coming to power in the major countries of Europe. Now, will they function differently? I don't know. I wouldn't vote for them. I'll tell you that. But still, I mean, this is something that the European establishments very much fear, and they brought it upon themselves.
What right-wing conservative friends in Germany told me is that the AfD on the national level is already converted to the standard way of thinking. It's the AfD on the local level that still has some of this not pacifist but non-militarist soul in it. But the process, the system is already doing to the AfD what they did to the Greens. It's washing them on the national level into becoming a government party. And basically getting them, especially on that part online. I don't know how true that actually is, but that's what my sources there tell me. Because it's systematic, right? The problem is systematic. And I do believe it's a way that these last 30 years actually developed for many of the Europeans. And look at the Epstein files and what they tell us about the intermingling of these elites, right?
Oh yeah,
All of the names there
it's
are
insane.
American, British, Central, European, right? Then you've got a piece of people in the Middle East, but that's about it. There's no Japanese, there's not many Russians, and so on. It's this entanglement. So it's one blob it's one thing, and it's going to be really painful, and it's going to take a long time to actually disentangle it, if it disentangles at all. I don't know.
Well, one possibility would be obviously the standard political system does not address basic social problems, and they fester. Politics will often move to the streets, and you'll get social disorder, riots, violence. I mean, I wouldn't rule that out as a possibility in Europe or in the United States for that matter.
No, it's true. Actually, in the end, what the U.S. plan was for Iran in January this year might very well happen at home. That real civil discontent might start haunting these countries. But the question to me, I mean, just to come also back again to Iran, is whether or not that was ever meant seriously. You know, this whole idea that Donald Trump touted out is like, okay, we're gonna bomb your regime, and then you Iranians, you stand up and you take over the government. Was that ever really meant as a strategy? Do you believe within the neoconservative framework they actually believe that something like this was possible? Or is it really just another kind of excuse in order to justify bombing people over there?
Well, there's a remarkable superficiality to neoconservative thinking. There always has been, that basically military, sort of a deification of military force and covert operations, and that military force solves all problems. I think the idea of decapitation here was something that transfixed both the Israelis and the United States, and I think that the superficial, immediate success of the Venezuela kidnapping of the president and his wife, as illegal as it may be, that probably supercharged the idea of trying to do something like that in Iran, and that somehow if we could remove, there's a very big focus on personalization in thinking here, that the problem the world faces are bad men. There's a great man theory of history here. It's all about bad men. Not very many bad women, but bad men. And they always have names: Putin and Milosevic and Kim Jong-un and Castro back in the old days, Gaddafi. And so I guess the idea is that we've so convinced ourselves that it's all about bad men. The superficiality of all this seems to have sunk in, you might say. If we simply decapitate the bad men, kill them or kidnap them, all will be well. I think there was some of that thinking going on here. In addition, I think there was a fallback option from the Israeli standpoint. I don't know if the Americans thought this, because I don't think this quite penetrated, but the Israelis may very well have felt that if you destabilize Iran such that they have social chaos, civil war, and national breakup over an extended period of time, that's not a bad outcome.
Yeah.
Because basically that means Iran would be effectively itself decapitated as a major country. They seem to rule out the fact that chaos itself can produce threats. They seem to leave out that detail. But nevertheless, I think that could very well be the Israeli thinking. I think from the American standpoint, the idea that basically you eliminate the leadership, you eliminate the bad men, you kill them, and that takes care of the problem will solve itself. It's remarkable how the same thing happened in Iraq when you invaded in 2003. The idea of we overthrow Saddam Hussein and everything would fall into place. There was no planning. As I recall, the number of American personnel, military and civilian, who even spoke Arabic was very small. And they really never had a real plan of what to do after they overthrew Saddam Hussein. And you might, in retrospect, and at the time it looked crazy, but somehow or another they had a certitude that basically all you need to do is use military force to overthrow the government, and everything would fall into place. That's been the neoconservative idea for a long time, and I think we've seen it play out here as well.
Yeah, I think you're also right about Israel. I mean, the main strategy, in my view, anything discernible if we take the last 30 years as reference, is that chaos in the environment actually really solves the problem, right? If if the potential adversaries are in utter disarray, then you're snug over there at the Mediterranean, right? Everything's okay. So, and if the same can be done to Iran and mega Syria, right? Then
That's right.
that
That's right.
that solves the problem.
Libya is another one.
I mean, also the other former kind of enemies like Libya were solved in that way, and they were solved.
Right.
I mean, they're not on the list of concerns anymore.
Yes, that's right. I think that, the long-term perspective is that chaos can produce terrorism. It can produce, obviously, subnational units possibly seeking weapons of mass destruction for who knows what purpose. There are all sorts of things that can rise out of chaos, none of which are good. But for some reason, again, the Israelis don't think about it in those terms. And they simplify the issue in terms of just destroying a country as a solution.
Yeah, because if you I mean, if you look at the people who take the decisions to do that, all of them so far have fared quite well with that strategy, right? None of the Israeli prime ministers, and especially Benjamin Netanyahu, never really suffered any kind of serious repercussion. On the opposite, I mean, the next airport over there might be named after him, and he might be remembered as among Ben Gurion and Herzog as the people who built the capacity of the state. The U.S. president built his peace board of peace, and he's thinking of himself as one of the 3 or 4 greatest presidents of the U.S. I mean, deserving like another head in Mount Rushmore. And they're not far away from achieving that. So the people responsible for this have only had success with the strategy that they used in the past.
You're right about that. That obviously there's the phrase "nothing succeeds like success," but also nothing fails like failure. Um, and my guess, the odds heavily fail some form of failure here. Exactly what form that will take is very hard to predict, but I just don't see it likely that this is going to end in a U.S. and Israeli success. If it does end in U.S.-Israeli success, that would probably encourage more interventions, further militarism, further risk-taking, with who knows what consequence. I mean, Cuba, I assume, would be next, and I don't know, maybe a ramped-up war against Russia because it gets so cocky, perhaps a war with China. It's hard to know, basically, how far this would go, but hubris, obviously, is kind of a self-fueling activity, and the more hubris you get, the more risks you take to enhance your hubris. And so I think that basically, one hates to say it, but the idea of the United States or Israel doing anything that could be defined as winning uh, would be a more dangerous outcome than
Yeah.
losing. Although losing is very dangerous too, because as you noted, the U.S. and/or Israel could resort to nuclear weapons.
Yep. No, absolutely. And that is true as well. In German, we've got a saying, hubris comes before the fall. So it's like, and it works, it works until it doesn't. It reminds me a little bit of the black swan problem. And the turkeys, right? The turkeys right before Thanksgiving saying everything is fine. The whole last year was just one steady growth of population, right? We are fine. It's fine until you're not. But if this Iran is going to be the event that actually is the final Thanksgiving for the turkeys is of course another question. The issue is that it again costs a lot of people's lives. I wish there was a way to constrain it, but it's just so bloody again.
Well, I mean, the loss of lives basically is not just military, but again, there was the Lancet study, which I'm sure you've seen reference to, which is that it's cumulative effects of U.S. sanctions over 50 years. I believe the figure they gave, the total death toll cumulative in all regions, was 38 million from U.S. sanctions alone. That's a lot of
500
deaths.
million people a year die of US and EU sanctions a year. 500,000, sorry. 500,000. 500,000 people every year from the sanctions. The direct and indirect effects, including, of course, not getting medicine. Funnily enough, my interview yesterday was with one of the authors of not that study, but the overall research group. It's devastating. It's devastating. And that's just economic sanctions. That doesn't
That's
account
right.
for the bombs that kill the people.
That's right.
Although, interestingly enough, that number is bigger than the number of people dying from the bombs.
That's right. Yeah, that's true. We're getting close to, I guess, closing the interview, but I did want to basically bring up the domestic politics in the United States of the war and note something. This really has been something of a historical turning point for my country, which is traditionally we have the familiar idea of rally around the flag. And when the president goes to war, initially has a great bump in his popularity. That doesn't work anymore. A majority of the public
Right.
at the very beginning of the war did not support the war. That's very unusual. Um, and it usually support declines over time. And so, if Trump loses this war, it's going to be devastating for him. Many people in his entourage, in the "Make America Great Again" entourage, Tucker Carlson, for example, um, Marjorie Taylor Greene, a very conservative congresswoman, have already condemned the war in the very strongest terms possible. They said, we voted for you as president because we thought you wouldn't do wars like this. You wouldn't be as interventionist as the Democrats. And here you're being just as bad or worse than they are. So I think this basically could cause something of a political explosion in the United States. And it's also indicates it's going to be much more difficult for future presidents of either party to go to war, just because if you cannot mobilize public opinion even at the beginning of the war, that's going to be very difficult to sustain politically. And so I think that part is a very big positive. What caused Trump to change? I don't know, because his first term was actually much less interventionist
Yes.
um, than previous presidents. This is a big reversal. And so why he changed suddenly in his second term, that I can't tell you.
I keep wondering if somebody actually, literally physically threatened him, because the way the one thing he was, there's a lot of bad things to say about him and his first term, but the one thing he was not was bloodthirsty. And if you look at his speech that he gave at the beginning of the war, it was completely bloodthirsty. It's like, you either surrender or we will kill you all. Everybody will die. It's like that he didn't do that before. I mean, something moved him into that space, and I wouldn't be surprised if he got physically threatened, with a knife on the table or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big mystery to me what exactly happened there, and I don't really have a good answer right now. I do note, though, there is that huge change. I do wonder also about people like Tulsi Gabbard, who's the National Intelligence Director, who in her career as a Democrat and then as a Republican was railing against the warmongers. Hillary Clinton was a warmonger. She's part of the war machine. That was her vocabulary. And here she is, still in the administration, at least publicly, in support of the war. J.D. Vance, not quite as vociferous as Tulsi Gabbard, but somewhat similarly. And he's publicly supporting the war. And so, again, how long this will last if things start to fall apart, as they may in the next couple of days, I don't know. But so far, at least, it's very surprising how people who really should know better have stepped with Trump.
I mean, it's a huge mystery, right? Because like these two figures, Vance and Gabbard, they are obviously not happy about this. They obviously belong to the non-neocon camp. The only thing I see is that they strategically wait for the moment to put the knife into the back of Donald Trump and publicly come out as opposing him. But maybe that's just wishful thinking.
I don't know. I can't predict what they're going to do. But on the whole, um, there's going to be no good outcome to this war, that's for sure. But I think the best outcome would be that Israel and the United States get taught a lesson in strong terms, that basically interventionism is a disaster. And other countries hopefully will learn the lesson that align with the United States having U.S. bases on their territory decreases their security in a very active and direct way. And hopefully that will sink into a lot of countries.
If that lesson was taken, it would be even more a reason to do neutrality studies to understand how to be safe without interventionism. David, that's a wonderful final word. People who want to find your writing or your publications, where should they go?
dgibbs.arizona.edu. I'll put that up when you put up a page for this video on YouTube. I'll give you the URL.
I'll put the link into the description box below. Everybody
Great.
check out David Gibbs' writings. Professor Gibbs, thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Pascal.